Battlefield Earth is often called one of the most disastrous movies in Hollywood history, and not just because of what ended up on screen. The real chaos happened long before audiences ever saw a single frame. At almost every stage of production, something went wrong, sometimes badly wrong. Movies usually run into one or two major problems. This one hit everything, almost like it was trying to fail on purpose, and in that sense, it actually succeeded. Some films feel like bad ideas from the very beginning. Battlefield Earth was one of them. Everyone in Hollywood could see it coming. A movie based on a novel by L. Ron Hubbard? That alone raised eyebrows. The founder of Scientology writing a massive sci-fi epic that was already considered unfilmable? Yeah, this didn't sound promising. Everyone understood that. Everyone except John Travolta. Travolta was obsessed with this project. He had been trying to get it made since the 1980s. Back then, though, his career was in rough shape. His movies were flopping, and studios didn't want to touch him. At one point, having Travolta in your film was basically seen as a guaranteed box office failure. Then Pulp Fiction happened, and suddenly, everything changed. Travolta went from career decline to one of the hottest stars in Hollywood almost overnight. Studios were lining up. His salary jumped to $15, even $20 million per film. Now, he finally had the power to push his dream project forward. And somehow, the only studio willing to say yes was a newly formed company called Franchise Pictures, which already tells you a lot. According to rumors, Tom Cruise even tried to convince Warner Brothers, who were distributing Franchise's films, to stay away from the project. His team later denied it, calling it pure fiction. Still, it's an interesting detail, especially considering that both Cruise and Travolta are the most famous Scientologists in Hollywood. Either way, nobody backed out. By the late 90s, the movie was officially happening. By that point, the script had already been rewritten more than 10 times. That's usually not a great sign, and even after all that, Travolta brought in yet another writer, Corey Mandel, to do one more rewrite, because apparently 10 wasn't enough. Originally, Travolta wanted to play the hero, Johnny Goodboy, but eventually he decided he was too old for the part, so he cast himself as the villain instead. For the lead role, he chose Barry Pepper, who impressed him the most during auditions. And then came pre-production, which is where things really started to fall apart. The producers couldn't find a director. Every filmmaker they approached was suddenly busy or unavailable, which, in Hollywood terms, usually means no chance. Travolta even offered the job to Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino took one look at the material and said no immediately. Said it wasn't for him. That's probably the nicest way to reject something like this. After going through what felt like half of Hollywood and getting turned down by directors like Ron Howard and Martin Campbell, they finally hired Roger Christian, a first-time director. Not exactly the safest choice for a big-budget sci-fi movie. He had mostly worked as a production designer before, including on Star Wars, and apparently George Lucas himself recommended him, which must have sounded reassuring at the time. In hindsight, maybe not so much. The studio reportedly gave the film a budget of around $75 million. And to save money, they decided to shoot in remote forests in Canada, because nothing says epic sci-fi blockbuster like the middle of nowhere. And very quickly, that decision started causing problems. According to Barry Pepper, the situation on set was rough. Really rough. The budget was so tight that the crew was basically starving. The catering was the worst he had ever seen in his career. And since they were filming far away from everything, there was no way to grab food anywhere else. No restaurants, no stores, nothing. At one point, things got so bad that the crew was ready to revolt. Literally. Pepper later said people were talking about putting Travolta and the producers on pitchforks. He and a few others were even preparing to disrupt filming. That's how bad it got. And then, ironically, the situation was saved by Travolta himself. While the crew was struggling, he had been eating the whole time separately. Once he found out what was going on, he stepped in. He started paying for food out of his own pocket and brought in his personal chef to cook for everyone. After that, things calmed down. The food improved. The atmosphere on set got better. For a moment, at least, it felt like things were under control. Travolta and the producers later defended the decision to shoot in Canada. They said it saved a lot of money and that filming the same movie in the US would have cost at least twice as much. That might be true, but at this point, the damage was already being done somewhere else. Because while the movie was still in production, the media had already started tearing it apart. articles were coming out criticizing the project before it was even finished. Travolta would later blame this early negative press for the film's failure. But honestly, it wasn't just the press being unfair. At one point, a publication got its hands on the script. They renamed it Dark Forces and sent it out to journalists and Hollywood producers, asking for honest feedback. Then they published the responses, and it was brutal. The nicest comments called the script stupid and ridiculous. The harsher ones went even further. Some people said reading it felt like watching a dung fly live out its entire life in real time. And somehow that was still just the beginning. Then came the test screenings, and this is where everything completely fell apart. Audiences didn't just dislike the movie, they tore it apart. The makeup looked ridiculous. The story made no sense. The direction felt off. And pretty much every actor got criticized. It wasn't one problem you could fix, it was everything, all at once. Normally, studios try to save a movie like this in editing. Cut the runtime, tighten things up, maybe hide the worst parts, but this? There was no fixing it in the edit. So Warner Brothers made a different call. They basically gave up on selling it. The marketing budget was slashed to the bare minimum, which is studio code for, we know this isn't gonna work. Director Roger Christian tried to explain what went wrong. He pointed to the budget, or more specifically, the lack of it. Even though the film was officially expensive, he claimed the actual resources were extremely limited, especially when it came to lighting. According to him, that's why the movie is filled with those infamous Dutch angles, tilted shots where the horizon is off and the camera looks up at the characters. Not a stylistic choice, a workaround. He said it was the only way to get enough light into the frame. At the same time, he tried to frame it as a creative decision, saying it gave the movie a comic book feel, which sounds good in theory. In reality, it just made everything look strange. But if there was one person who refused to accept reality, it was John Travolta. While the studio was quietly backing away, Travolta went all in. In interviews, he didn't just defend the movie, he hyped it up like it was a masterpiece. At one point, he called Battlefield Earth the Schindler's List of science fiction. Yes, that's an actual quote. He also claimed it was better than Star Wars. Not inspired by it, not comparable to it, better. And he didn't stop there. Travolta was already talking about the future. Multiple sequels, a big-budget animated film, a full franchise. According to him, all of this would start as soon as the movie hit theaters. It's the kind of confidence that almost feels surreal considering everything happening around the project at the time. Because by then, the negative buzz was everywhere. People in Hollywood had already made up their minds. Then the movie finally came out, and it crashed. Hard. Battlefield Earth made about $29 million worldwide against a $75 million budget. A clean, undeniable flop. But somehow that still wasn't the end of the story. Because after the release, things took an even darker turn. One of the investors sued Franchise Pictures, accusing the studio of fraud. And during the court cases in the early 2000s, something interesting came out. The official budget of the film was listed at $75 million. But in reality, only around $40 had actually been spent on production. The rest of the money? According to the claims, it went elsewhere. This wasn't an isolated accusation either. Franchise Pictures had already been suspected of inflating budgets on multiple projects. And once the lawsuits started piling up, the pattern became hard to ignore. In the end, the studio was ordered to pay over $100 million back to investors. That's what finally pushed Franchise Pictures into bankruptcy, and Battlefield Earth ended up being part of a much bigger story than just a failed movie. A similar situation later came up with another film they worked on, A Sound of Thunder, which was also reported to have a massively inflated budget. After the box office failure, people who worked on the film started speaking out, and they didn't hold back. Barry Pepper openly blamed John Travolta. He said Travolta approved a terrible script and that a huge portion of the budget went to his salary. Travolta denied it. According to him, he was paid $10 million for the film, which was actually lower than his usual rate at the time. For comparison, he made $20 million for The General's Daughter, and the same amount for Swordfish. So, depending on who you believe, the truth sits somewhere in between. What isn't up for debate is how the movie was received. Battlefield Earth won 7 Golden Raspberry Awards. The only actor who avoided a Razzie was Forrest Whitaker, and even he later apologized to fans for being part of the film. Over time, it got even worse. The movie picked up additional Razzies as the worst film of the decade, and even one of the worst films of the past 25 years. It shows up on pretty much every worst movies ever made list out there. Barry Pepper, who actually won a Razzie for his role, later said he would have happily shown up to accept it if he had known he was nominated, because in his own words, he completely agreed with the criticism. That tells you a lot. Producer Ely Samaha had a slightly different take. He admitted that many of the complaints were fair, but he believed the level of backlash was amplified by bias against Scientology. According to him, the film itself didn't really push that ideology, but people judged it anyway because of who was involved. Screenwriter J.D. Shapiro took a different approach. He apologized. Repeatedly. He even showed up in person at the Razzie Awards to accept the prize for Worst Screenplay. And he didn't try to defend it. In fact, he said that out of all the bad movies ever made in Hollywood, Battlefield Earth might actually be the worst of them. He did point out that his script had been heavily rewritten by Corey Mendel, but because of Writers Guild rules, he couldn't remove his name from the credits. So he ended up sharing the blame. And the Razzie. After that, both writers essentially disappeared from major Hollywood projects. And yet, after all of this, there is still one person who refuses to see it that way: John Travolta. To this day, whenever he's asked about Battlefield Earth, he stands by it. He says the movie was great, that he's proud of it, and that he would absolutely come back for a sequel. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.